So what we're doing today and what we have the amazing opportunity to do is have a Q&A, a sort of a discussion with David Zeiger here, which is super exciting. Um, he's here because this is the benefit for Refuse Fascism. And
I didn't start making films till the late '80s, early '90s, and from the time I started making films, I knew that this was a story that needed to be told. But it wasn't until a friend of mine, a veteran, in the early 2000s, gave me a copy of Jerry Lemke's book, The Spitting Image, that I began to understand how critical this story is and how deeply it had been buried in the American consciousness, and certainly in the history of the 60s. I knew this was a film I wanted to make. This film was made in 2005. I think we premiered it in festivals in 2005. It was in theaters in 2007. It had a huge impact, and it was very specifically because of the Iraq War that the film had that kind of impact. We were on television around the world. We were in 70 cities, in theaters. It was widely reviewed, and everyone recognized the importance of it in relation to what was going on then. And in fact, the film played a big role in the formation of Iraq Veterans Against the War. I've worked with Boots a lot on previous projects and films, and he's just been a tremendous supporter of things. Yeah, he wrote the song for the conclusion of the film. He claims that was the inspiration that he took to start making films. I'm not sure I believe that, but that was a great collaboration with Boots and with Ken Burns' series about the Vietnam War. It was a very big deal a few years back on PBS. Doesn't say a word, not one word, not one even hint of what was going on of the GI movement in that series. And after seeing this film, you can see how much he had to very consciously decide not to tell in order to tell a story about the Vietnam War that really pretty much ended up being in the vein of "thank you for your service," that response to any kind of anti-war activity. I think it was Cisco and Ebert gave it a very glowing review, and they mentioned in that review how amazed they were at the whole spitting image story. And they, along with everyone else, had said, we had no idea that, we just assumed that this was something that happened. And they got blasted by, right-wingers for that review. And that really was the only pushback, at least that I'm aware of, that the film experienced. The very powerful reality of this is that the majority of people who played major roles in the GI movement, just about all the people you saw in my film, they weren't drafted, they enlisted. And as several of them talked about, they enlisted for patriotic reasons, they enlisted because they came from military families, they enlisted because they thought this was the right thing to do, that their country was at war. And those were the people who were the most deeply betrayed by the reality of that war. And I think that says a lot for possibilities today, by the way. That that betrayal was a big part of what got people motivated to take the stands that they took. The Army was the only one that drafted people. The Navy and the Marines were volunteers, people who had gone in on purpose. So that's an important point and a very, I think, optimistic point about possibilities as things inevitably are going to emerge today, that in which people inside the military are going to be called on and forced to do things that go very directly against their own personal consciences. What made it so significant was exactly the fact that the people who were in the movement were really up against tremendous odds. And they were willing to do that because of the reality of what they were faced with and what they wanted to accomplish. And that's something that I don't think is tied necessarily to a particular era, that it's possible and will become increasingly necessary. And I think it's something that really needs to be focused on as much as possible in the period coming up. So there was an optimism, ironically, in that time. You know, when we were faced with so much horror, there was an optimism that it could be, you know, that a new society could come out of it. And it's so important for that optimism to exist in order for there to be a real movement. And I think it's important to find the sources of that optimism and very much make those part of what goes on. Just to put this on a personal level, all of my films that I've made come out of my own life, come out of my own experience. Both in this case, obviously, you know, my experience in the 60s. I have a film that my father plays a big role in. I have a film that my son played a big role, and a series that about my high school. But it's always important to me to take that experience and make it universal. And I think that was a big part of this film. It's why Sir No Sir is the film that has a lot more staying power than my other work, because it has that universality to it and that relevance that keeps coming up to it. The connection between how movements grow and how the response of the authorities shape those movements. It seems to me today that things are, the stakes are much, much higher today, ironically, than they were in this situation. I think I'm an example of someone who came out of the student movement and realizing that you had to get to the heart of the problem, which was in the military, to really, you know, go after the war, played a big role in supporting the GI movement. Most of the coffee houses, for example, in Killeen, the staff was about half veterans and half students like myself who had left the student movement and came down to these bases to play a role. There had been situations where military bases where leaflets have been passed out and things like that because of the possibility of the army being called into cities in this country. There was something that Refuse Fascism did in Los Angeles about a month or 2 months ago, where they staged a guerrilla theater situation where people had volunteered to be detainees, and they were rounded up and they were forced onto their knees, and they had their heads shaved. And it was theater, but it was very, very powerful, and it was very moving, and that is similar to what DeAndre described. The VVAW would go on these long treks through into towns, you know, acting out what they had done in Vietnam. I don't know. I mean, I think what's being done to essentially, particularly Latino people right now in this country is so similar, and it certainly can be portrayed in the horror that it is, even beyond the actual horror that we're seeing all the time.
Trump must go now! Yeah!